I went camping alone in late October of 2019, a few miles outside a small town in northern Idaho. I was 26 at the time, and I had been trying to get away from work stress, phone noise, and the same daily routine. I thought that a quiet night in the woods, away from everything, would help me clear my head. I picked a spot beside a narrow river that curved through the trees like a thin silver ribbon. The air smelled clean, with a mix of wet leaves, pine, and cold water drifting off the riverbank. There was no wind, only the slow moving of the current and the crunch of leaves under my boots as I set up my tent. The sun went down early, and everything turned orange for a moment before fading into a dull blue. I walked around collecting dry sticks and fallen branches for a fire. The ground was covered in layers of dead leaves that stuck together from the week's earlier rain. Each step made a soft squashing sound. When I finally got the fire going, the flames made the trees glow on one side while their shadows stretched long and sharp on the other. I cooked a simple meal, ate slowly, and tried to enjoy the silence. It felt peaceful at first, almost perfect. I could hear nothing but the river and the small crackles of firewood burning. But after an hour or so, that same silence started to feel like it was pressing in from every direction. When you sit alone in the woods at night, every small sound becomes bigger than it should be. A twig snapping far away sounds close. A leaf falling off a branch feels like something stepping behind you. You start to think about things you normally wouldn't think about. I tried to steady my breathing and looked up at the sky. The stars were bright and scattered everywhere, the kind of view you only get far away from towns and roads. I sat there until the fire began to die down. Then I added more wood. As I leaned forward to place the branches, I felt something in the air shift. It wasn't wind. It was the sense that something in the environment had changed, even though I couldn't see what. It made me pause for a moment, staring into the trees. The forest was dark, thick, and messy. The trunks were tall and close together, and the spaces between them looked like deep holes filled with complete blackness. I tried to shrug off the uneasy feeling and went back to tending the fire. At some point around midnight, I heard something heavy move through the trees on the opposite side of the river. It wasn't the small tapping of a squirrel or the zigzag rustling of a bird. It was slower, heavier, like something with weight behind it. The river wasn't wide, maybe 15 or 16 feet across, so anything on the other side felt close. My first thought was that it was an elk or a deer. This area had plenty of them, but usually those animals moved in short bursts or quick steps. This sound was different. It was almost measured, like it was taking its time. I tried to look across the river but saw nothing, just darkness and the faint shapes of branches. The sound stopped, and then everything went silent again. Too silent. Even the river seemed to sound quieter than before, like it was trying not to draw attention to itself. I felt my skin tighten along my arms and shoulders. I stayed seated, telling myself it was just wildlife and nothing more, but my body didn't believe it. When the fire started shrinking again, I stood up to grab more wood. I walked a little farther from the riverbank this time, deeper into the woods behind my tent. My flashlight lit only a short path ahead of me, leaving everything else in a dull haze. I bent down to pick up a long branch, and right then I heard a sound I hadn't expected: slow, steady breathing. I froze instantly. It wasn't mine. It came from somewhere behind a tree about 10 or 12 feet away. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't soft either. It sounded controlled, like someone trying to keep calm. I didn't move. I didn't lift my head. I stayed in that position for several seconds, gripping the branch tighter in my hand. My back felt cold even though my face was warm from the fire. I finally straightened up and slowly stepped backward. My flashlight shook a little as I moved. I kept the beam pointed toward the trees, but I still couldn't see anything. The breathing stopped as soon as I moved, which somehow made the whole thing even worse. I grabbed whatever wood I could carry and walked back to my tent without looking away from the tree line. When I returned to the fire, I added the wood quickly and tried to act normal, but I could feel my heartbeat thumping hard. I didn't want to panic, but my body was already going into that mode. The idea of being miles away from other people suddenly felt like a bad decision. I sat by my tent, watching the trees, waiting for another sound. For a long time, nothing happened. The forest stayed still. My breathing was the only thing I could hear besides the fire and the river. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear. But if it had been a bear, it would have kept moving or made noise again. Sometime near 2 a.m., the breathing returned. This time it was closer, on my side of the river. I didn't hear water splashing earlier, so whatever it was must have crossed at a shallow area upstream or downstream. The sound was faint but real, slow and steady, coming from the left side of my camp. I didn't stand up. I didn't move. I just sat there with my back slightly straighter, staring into the dark. The fire was low again, which made the shadows stronger. The breathing grew tighter, almost like whoever or whatever was doing it was trying not to make noise but couldn't hold it in anymore. My throat felt dry. I reached for my backpack and slowly unzipped it. My hands were shaking so hard that the zipper made a soft rattling sound. The breathing stopped instantly. I froze again. I didn't want to look away from the trees, but I needed what was in the backpack. I pulled out my small hatchet, gripping it with both hands, and kept it ready against my leg. Minutes passed without sound. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a fast, sudden movement. Leaves shifting, weight hitting the ground. Something running, not directly at me, but fast, angled away through the trees. It was gone within seconds, but the speed of it made the hair on my neck stand straight up. It wasn't a slow animal. It wasn't drunk wandering. It was something or someone bolting through the woods with purpose. I didn't wait after that. I put dirt on the fire, grabbed my bag, and stuffed everything I needed inside. I tore down the tent halfway and then gave up, deciding I'd rather lose it than stay any longer. I slung my pack onto my back, held the hatchet in my hand, and walked fast toward the narrow trail that led back to where I parked my car. My flashlight beam shook across the ground, bouncing off roots and dead branches. Every sound behind me made me walk faster. By the time I reached my car, the sky was starting to lighten into a faint early morning gray. I unlocked the door, threw my bag inside, and got in so quickly that I scraped my shoulder on the frame. I locked the doors, started the engine, and pulled out without checking the mirrors. I didn't breathe normally again until I was several miles away from the forest. When I finally stopped at a gas station back in town, I stepped out of the car and noticed something on my shirt. A thin smear of dirt near my left shoulder, but not from me falling or brushing against anything. It looked like a handprint, a small one, like someone had touched me lightly in the dark when I wasn't aware. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was just dirt from packing quickly, but the shape bothered me the entire drive home. I never went back to that campsite. I still go camping sometimes, but only in well-known areas or places with other people nearby. Whenever I think about that night, the thing that scares me the most is not the breathing, not the footsteps, not the running. It's the silence in between. The way whoever was out there watched me without making a sound. The way they moved only when I moved. The thought that someone might have been standing just outside the reach of my light, waiting and watching, makes my stomach twist even now. I'm still not sure if it was a person or an animal, but I know it wasn't my mind playing tricks. Something was there, something close, something careful, and the only reason I'm certain is because I can still remember the exact way the air felt that night. Heavy, cold, and full of something I couldn't see but knew was real. And that's why I left before sunrise and never camped alone again. I was 26 when I decided to camp alone in the northern woods of Alberta in late September 2019. I had been stressing about work for months, and I wanted a quiet weekend with no people, no noise, and no responsibilities. I picked a spot near a wide clearing about 2 hours from the nearest small town. The area wasn't a popular campsite, which was exactly why I chose it. The fewer people around, the better I felt. I parked my car at the end of a dirt trail, walked a bit through the trees, and set up my small tent beside a line of tall spruce trees. The air smelled like cold needles and damp soil, and everything around me felt still, like the woods were watching but not moving. I spent most of the afternoon collecting firewood and trying to settle in. I like to keep things simple, so I brought just the basics: food, water, a flashlight, a map, a small knife, a cheap camping stove, and a metal pot. The weather was cool, but not freezing, and the sky stayed clear with a soft gray tone. I didn't think too much about the time. I just kept busy, enjoying the way the wind brushed through the branches above me. By evening, the temperature dropped faster than I expected. The sun sank behind the trees in a slow, heavy way, and the shadows stretched out like long arms reaching across the clearing. I made myself something warm to eat, watched the steam rise from the pot, and listened to the tiny pops from the fire. I could hear the forest settling, birds getting quiet, and small animals moving through the brush. It was peaceful, but in that kind of way that felt too quiet, almost like the whole place was waiting for something. When it finally got dark, a different feeling settled in my chest. The darkness wasn't soft like it is in a city. It felt thick, almost textured, like it had weight. My flashlight only cut through a small part of it, leaving everything outside that beam feeling close and crowded. I tried to focus on the fire and the warm light it gave, but the edges of the clearing looked darker than they should. Every time the wind shifted, the branches scraped against each other in a way that sounded like something walking just out of sight. I tried to ignore the feeling. I told myself it was normal to get slightly uneasy when camping alone far from anyone. But even as I sat close to the fire, I kept turning my head at small sounds I normally wouldn't care about. A twig snapping, leaves crunching, something dragging lightly across the ground. Each sound came from a different direction, and each time I couldn't see anything past the tree line. The longer it went on, the more my body reacted before my mind did. My shoulders stayed tight, and I kept my hands ready to grab the flashlight fast. At one point, while adding more wood to the fire, I smelled something strange. It was sharp, like old metal mixed with wet dirt. It wasn't the fire, and it wasn't the forest. It reminded me of rusted tools or dried blood. It drifted in from the space behind my tent. I turned slowly, shining my flashlight in that direction, but the beam didn't catch anything except dark branches and tall grass. The smell faded as quickly as it came, but it left a heavy pressure in my stomach. The wind died down completely around midnight. Without it, the silence felt unnatural, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I decided to get inside my tent and try to sleep, even though my nerves were already sharp. Inside, the air felt warmer, but it didn't help. The nylon walls were too thin. Every sound outside came through louder than normal. I lay still on my sleeping bag, listening to the soft ticking of my heartbeat and the faint crackle of the dying fire. I don't know how much time passed before I heard the first heavy footstep. It wasn't a small animal. It wasn't light or quick. It was slow, firm, and deliberate. Then another, and another. Each one landed in the dried leaves just beyond the tent, and they sounded heavy enough to belong to a grown person, or something close to that size. I stayed frozen, my breath stuck in my throat. I didn't move, not even a finger. The steps circled part of the tent, then stopped near the entrance. I could hear breathing through the nylon. It wasn't loud, but it was close enough that I could feel the sound more than hear it. A slow, steady exhale, like someone trying not to make noise. I lay there for what felt like hours, barely blinking, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. No steps moving away. No sound of running. Just silence again. At some point, exhaustion mixed with fear and my body shut down for a moment. When I opened my eyes again, the tent was filled with early morning light. I had no memory of falling asleep. I slowly unzipped the tent, my hands shaking slightly, and stepped out. The cold morning air hit me hard. I turned in a full circle, scanning the clearing. That's when I saw the footprints. They were in the soft dirt around the back of my tent. Large, deep, clearly human. Bare feet. Every step pressed enough into the dirt to show the full shape of the toes. They weren't mine. They were bigger and spaced farther apart. They circled around the tent in a slow, careful path, then walked off into the trees. I followed them only with my eyes, not my feet. They disappeared into the thick brush, and I had no interest in finding out where they led. The air still carried that faint metal smell, just enough for me to connect it to whatever or whoever had been out there. I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands kept slipping because they were shaking so much. I didn't look around for long. I didn't bother eating. I didn't even put out the last pieces of burnt wood properly. I just kicked dirt over them and grabbed my bag. Walking back to the car felt like the longest walk of my life. Every snapped twig behind me made me speed up, even though I didn't hear anything close. I didn't feel safe until I was inside my car with the doors locked. When I finally reached the town, sunlight warming the road, I pulled into a gas station and sat there gripping the wheel. I kept replaying the night in my mind, trying to think of something logical, some explanation that made sense. But there wasn't one that fit. Someone had been out there, barefoot, walking circles around my tent in the freezing night. Someone who didn't speak, didn't run, didn't try to hide their presence, and simply breathed inches away from where I slept. I never went back to that area again. I still camp sometimes, but never alone, and never that deep in the woods. The footprints, the smell, the slow steps in the dark, those things stay in my mind even years later. And the worst part is knowing that whoever was out there, moving slowly around me, probably watched me long before I even noticed a single sound. And I will never know how long they stood there, or why they left. I went camping alone in the fall of 2018, near a small lake in northern Wyoming. I was 30 at the time, tired of my job, and wanted peace for a weekend. I picked a place far from the main trails, an area where the forest grew thick and the ground felt soft from old pine needles. The weather was cool but not freezing, and the air smelled sharp and clean. I reached the spot just before sunset, carrying a heavy pack that dug into my shoulders. I felt proud of myself for picking a place so quiet that I could hear my own breathing. The lake was small and still. The water looked almost black when the light faded, and even the breeze barely touched it. I set my tent a few yards away, on a flat patch where the grass was short. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, ate it while sitting on a log, and let myself relax. In the distance, I heard nothing except the occasional snap of a branch or the soft movement of some animal far off. It felt good to be away from everything. My phone had no signal, which bothered me at first, but after a while it felt freeing. When darkness settled, it came quickly. The trees closed in around me, and the lake disappeared into a thick sheet of black. I turned on my small lantern and placed it inside the tent. The glow felt warm, almost too warm compared to the cold outside. I crawled into my sleeping bag, closed the zipper tight, and waited for sleep. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe without tension in my chest. Sometime around midnight, I woke up. I didn't sit up or move right away. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep. My mind felt dull and slow. Then I realized I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. A soft scraping sound. It reminded me of someone dragging something across dirt. The sound paused every few seconds, then continued again. I held my breath and listened harder. My tent was thin, and even small sounds felt close. The scraping grew clearer the longer I stayed still. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal digging. It had a rhythm that felt deliberate. These woods were known for bears and moose, but this didn't match either. I stayed frozen for a long time, unsure what to do. I kept thinking it would stop soon, that maybe it was just a branch moving or something falling. But then I heard careful footsteps, slow, spaced apart, like someone trying not to be heard. The sound circled the tent once, then again, each step landing lightly but not lightly enough to be an animal. My skin felt tight. My heartbeat felt too loud inside my ears. I stayed absolutely still, barely even breathing. I couldn't see anything through the tent walls except the faint shadow of trees moving when the wind picked up. I figured it could be a hiker who got lost, but the footsteps never moved toward the trail. They stayed close to my camp, and every once in a while, something brushed against the side of the tent, just enough to make the fabric shift. I didn't want to unzip the tent and look. My mind kept showing me images I didn't want to think about. I waited, hoping the person would walk away, but the footsteps stayed for a long time. At one point, I heard breathing. Not mine. It wasn't heavy breathing, but it was close enough that I could tell it came from a human. It rose in a slow, controlled rhythm, like someone standing still and listening to me. I kept my eyes open inside the dark tent, staring at nothing yet afraid to blink. After what felt like hours, the breathing stopped. The footsteps moved away, slow at first, then faster. I heard them fade into the woods. The scraping sound returned one last time, then went silent. I waited for a long time before moving. When the sky started turning gray, I finally unzipped the tent. The cold morning air hit my face hard. The area around my tent looked normal at first, but then I saw the ground. There were footprints around the tent, not animal prints, but clear shoe prints, deep in the dirt. They made a full circle around the tent, then stopped near the back, where the grass was bent as if someone had stood there for a long time. But what unsettled me more was the tree near my tent. On the bark, there was a long, fresh mark, like someone had dragged a knife or sharp object across it. It wasn't a deep cut, but it was straight, deliberate, and new. I checked my gear to see if anything had been taken, but everything was where I left it. My food bag was untouched. My backpack looked fine. I felt watched even though the woods were quiet. The sun rose slowly, but its light did nothing to make me feel safer. I packed as fast as I could, my hands shaking the entire time. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing far off between the trees. The entire forest felt wrong, as if something had happened in the night that I wasn't supposed to experience. As I walked back toward the trail, I noticed more marks on the trees. Thin, straight scratches at shoulder height. Some were old, but some looked newer. They lined the path like silent signs. I walked faster than I ever had with a pack on my back. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't stop to drink water. The entire time, I felt like someone might step out from behind a tree and block the path. When I reached the parking area, my car felt like the safest place in the world. I threw my pack in the back seat, locked the doors, and just sat there with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't start the engine for several minutes. I kept staring at the empty trailhead, waiting to see movement. Nothing came out. I drove away and didn't look back. Later, when I thought about it, I realized something important. Whoever was out there that night didn't want my food or my gear. They didn't try to steal anything. They didn't try to approach during daylight. They only stood near my tent in the dark, circling, listening, scraping a mark on a tree. It wasn't hunger or need. It was curiosity. And that made it worse because people with normal intentions don't watch strangers sleep in the middle of the night. I never went camping alone again after that. I never planned to spend the last week of September alone in the woods, but after a long year of working late nights, I felt like I needed to be somewhere quiet. I picked a small state forest in northern Idaho, far from the big highways, the kind of place where you barely see another person even on weekends. I had camped before, but never alone for more than a night. I was 26 at the time and felt like I knew enough to handle myself. I wanted the silence, the smell of pine, the cold mornings, the long dirt trails where you can think without hearing anything except your own boots and the wind. The weather was dry and warm that week. I parked my car on a narrow pull-off beside an unmarked service road and hiked about 1.5 miles into the woods to a flat clearing beside a creek. The place looked untouched. Tall, thick pines surrounded the little opening. There was soft dirt under the needles, and the creek made a steady rushing sound that felt calming. I set up my small green tent near a fallen log and laid out my gear. Stove, food bag, a metal pot, my knife, and a small first aid kit. The first day was peaceful. I spent most of it walking along the creek, collecting firewood, and trying to settle my mind. I noticed a few small things that seemed off, but I brushed them away at the time. A set of tire tracks on the dirt road that looked fresh even though I hadn't passed any vehicle. A few broken branches at shoulder height that didn't look like they snapped from the wind. Small things. I reminded myself that the forest had animals, storms, and other hikers. Nothing strange about that. That night, I sat near the fire until it burned low. The air got cold fast, colder than I expected. When I finally crawled into the tent, the forest sounded completely still. No insects, no birds, just the creek. I fell asleep slow, waking up a few times because the ground felt uneven under my sleeping pad. Once, around midnight, I opened my eyes and thought I heard something move outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just a small, steady crunch of dirt like a single step. I held my breath, waiting for another sound, but the forest stayed quiet. I told myself it was a pine cone falling or maybe a raccoon. After a minute or so, I fell asleep again. The second morning felt normal. I heated water for coffee, stretched my legs, walked along the water. It was so still that I could hear the echo of a woodpecker from what felt like miles away. When I returned to camp that afternoon, I noticed something small but strange. One of my boot prints from the morning had another print overlapping the edge. Not a full footprint, more like the front half of a shoe. The shape was narrow, with a tread I didn't recognize. I stared at it too long, trying to decide if I had stepped there twice without remembering. Eventually, I convinced myself that it could have been mine from another angle. Later in the afternoon, I hiked farther west along the creek. The sun dropped behind the trees early, and shadows stretched across the trail. As I turned back toward camp, I kept feeling like something was behind me, not close, just watching. Every time I stopped, the forest went completely still, which made the feeling worse. I tried to shake it off and focused on getting back before the light was gone. When I reached camp again, I noticed the second strange thing of that day. My food bag, which I had hung from a tree branch earlier, was swinging slightly. Not like the wind pushing it, more like something had bumped it. It was tied high enough that a small animal wouldn't reach it. My stomach tightened a little, but I told myself maybe I had tied it poorly and the branch moved. Nightfall came quick and thick. Clouds covered the sky, making the forest unnaturally dark. I didn't make a fire that night because the air felt too still and heavy. I sat inside the tent with my headlamp, reading a few pages from an old paperback. Around 9, I heard another sound, soft, steady, like slow steps on dirt. Not the random scatter of an animal, more controlled. I didn't move. I held my breath so long that my chest burned. The steps stopped right where the tree line began. I couldn't see anything through the tent fabric, but I felt something out there, just standing, listening. After a long moment, the sound faded. I didn't know if the thing walked away or simply stayed silent. I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up every 30 minutes. At one point, I smelled something faint, like cigarette smoke carried on the wind. But the air outside was still, and I hadn't seen anyone on the trails. The third day, I finally admitted something was wrong. When I stepped out of the tent in the morning, the first thing I saw was a thin strip of torn fabric lying in the dirt. It was from my backpack. The pack was still there, leaning against the log, but a small section near the bottom pocket had been cut. Not ripped, cut. A clean slice. My skin crawled. Someone had been in my camp while I slept. I looked around but found nothing else disturbed. No footprints in the soft dirt. Nothing missing. No sign of animal claws. The silence felt heavier than before, like the trees were hiding something. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to panic. I tried to tell myself that maybe I had scraped the backpack on a branch or rock without noticing. But as the day went on, I couldn't relax. Every small sound, every twig snapping or leaf rustling, made my heart jump. In the late afternoon, I followed the creek again, trying to clear my head. On the way back, I noticed something that finally made everything click. A single footprint on a patch of soft mud. Not mine, not a hiking boot. A flat shoe worn down at the heel. The print pointed toward my camp. Someone had been following me. I moved slowly back toward camp, keeping my eyes on the trees. The forest felt wrong now. Too quiet, too heavy. I didn't want to spend another night out there. I started packing immediately, stuffing gear into the torn backpack without caring about the order. While I worked, I heard something again. Footsteps, slow, careful, coming from behind the thick pines to my right. My hands shook as I grabbed my pocket knife, the only thing I had. I didn't see anyone, but I felt eyes on me. I made a decision then. I didn't care how late it was or how long the hike back would take. I needed to leave before the sun went down. I slung the backpack over my shoulder and started walking fast toward the trail, not running but close to it. I kept glancing over my shoulder. The forest looked the same, but every shadow felt alive. After a few minutes, I heard the footsteps again, matching my pace, staying just far enough back that I couldn't see who made them. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. My breath felt thin and sharp. The trail looked endless, twisting between the trees. I kept moving until I finally reached the service road where my car was parked. By then, it was almost dark. The forest behind me looked like a solid wall. I unlocked the car with shaking hands, threw my pack inside, and got in. As I shut the door, I saw something at the edge of the tree line. A tall shape, motionless, half hidden behind a trunk. I couldn't make out a face or clothes, just the outline of a person standing perfectly still, watching. I started the car and drove without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I parked in front of a gas station and sat there for almost an hour before I could breathe normally again. I never reported it. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know who it was or what they wanted. All I knew was that someone had been watching me for days, walking near my tent at night, cutting my bag, following my steps through the forest. I haven't camped alone since that week in 2017, and I don't think I ever will again. I still think about the moment I saw that shape by the trees, the stillness of it, the patience. It makes me realize how much worse it could have ended if I had stayed just one more night. Every once in a while, when I'm driving through quiet places or walking alone on a trail, I get that same feeling on the back of my neck, like someone is out there in the trees, standing still, waiting for me to stop moving long enough to notice them again. And every time it happens, I keep walking. I don't look back. I won't give whatever I felt in those woods another chance. I had been planning that trip since late summer, telling myself that I needed a few days alone, far away from the noise of the city, far away from screens, and far away from people. By the time early October came in 2021, the idea had grown into something I felt I had to do. I picked a remote spot in northern Wyoming, on the edge of a long valley covered in tall yellow grass and scattered pine trees. I had checked maps for days, trying to make sure the place was quiet but still close enough to trails so I wouldn't get completely lost. I was 27 back then, still convinced I knew how to handle the outdoors because I had spent my teenage years camping with cousins, even though I hadn't done a long solo trip in years. I reached the spot in the late afternoon after a long drive on dirt roads. The air felt cold and clean, with that dry smell that only open land has. I parked near a narrow path and walked for about 40 minutes until I reached a small rise in the valley. From up there, I could see the grassland stretch far out until it met a dark line of trees. There were no cabins, no signs of animals, no other people, and no noise except wind brushing through the grass. I set up my tent facing the open valley. It took longer than it should have because the ground was uneven. I hammered the stakes in as deep as I could. I laid out my sleeping bag, organized my food in a metal box, and set my backpack under a pine tree. Once camp was settled, I walked around slowly, taking photos, touching the rough bark of trees, listening to the constant low push of the wind. The sky dimmed into that pale gray-blue color that happens just before sunset. I ate early, a simple meal warmed on a small gas stove, and tried to keep my thoughts calm as darkness filled the valley. I felt excited but also tense in a way I couldn't explain. As the night came in, the cold became sharp. I got into my tent, zipped everything tight, and lay in my sleeping bag listening to the steady tapping of the canvas as the wind shook the tent. It wasn't loud, but it never stopped. That constant movement made sleep hard to find. I kept drifting in and out of light dreams. Every time I woke up, I listened, making sure nothing else moved outside. Somewhere deep in the night, when the air felt colder than before, I woke up again, but this time it wasn't the wind. I felt a soft vibration in the ground under me. At first I thought it was just me imagining things because I was half asleep, but the vibration came again, like a short, low thump traveling through the dirt. It wasn't loud, more like someone walking slowly somewhere not too far from my tent, heavy steps that pushed weight into the soil. I kept still and held my breath. The steps were spaced apart, slow and heavy, and seemed to get closer, but never directly toward me. I couldn't see anything through the tent wall. It was too dark outside. I tried to steady my breathing and calm myself down by thinking it was probably a deer or maybe even a moose. But the steps had a pattern that didn't feel like an animal. They were too slow, too careful, and they paused too often. I lay awake for what felt like an hour, waiting for the steps to fade fully. Eventually, the sound stopped. I stayed awake long after that, listening to every tiny noise. When morning arrived, I crawled out of my tent with stiff arms and shaking legs. The valley looked calm again, filled with soft yellow light. Nothing looked disturbed except for one detail. The ground around the backside of my tent had fresh marks in the dirt. They were long and narrow, like someone had dragged their foot or boot heel lightly. I crouched and looked closer. The prints had structure, not random shapes like hooves or animal pads. They were long strides, far longer than mine, and placed in an uneven path that moved across the grass and ended near the tree line behind my camp. I tried to tell myself it could have been an old trail, or maybe hikers had passed by before I arrived, but the marks were sharp and fresh. The soil still looked loose along the edges of the prints. My stomach stayed tight even as I packed away my stove and tried to clean up camp. I convinced myself that whoever it was had simply passed by and kept going. Maybe a hunter, I reasoned, or someone wandering early in the morning to check the area. Still, something felt wrong because I hadn't heard any human-like movement. No equipment, no rustling bags, no voices, only the slow steps. I spent the second day hiking around the valley, trying to distract myself. I followed trails, checked my map often, and took long routes through clusters of trees. But the feeling of being watched kept following me. Every time the wind dropped and the valley went quiet, I felt a thin pressure in my chest, like the air was waiting for something to happen. I didn't see anyone all day. No distant figures, no fresh tracks besides my own. Still, the sense of being observed never fully left. That night, I tried to stay awake longer. I sat inside my tent with my flashlight off, listening to the wind push the canvas again and again. Hours passed slowly until I finally lay down and tried to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up again, but this time the air around me felt too still. No wind, no movement, just a deep, heavy quiet that felt wrong for such an open valley. Then I heard it, the slow pressure in the soil again, like weight shifting from one step to another. I felt it before I heard it. Tiny vibrations traveling through the ground and into the thin fabric of the tent floor. The steps moved in a wide half circle around my tent, never close enough to cast a shadow, but close enough that I could feel each step in my legs. They were cautious, almost testing the ground. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I stayed frozen, staring upward at the dark wall of the tent. The steps continued for a long time. I counted them in my head to calm myself, but I lost track after a while. Eventually, the movement grew faint and drifted away into the valley. The quiet settled again, thick and unmoving. By morning, the new tracks circled my tent in a strange looping pattern. Long strides again, uneven spacing, moving around the camp as if someone had been studying it. There were no nearby prints leading in or out of the loops, just those long steps pressed deep into the dirt. I didn't wait to think. I packed everything rushed and uneven, stuffed gear into my backpack, barely folded my tent. My hands shook so hard I dropped steaks twice. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't look around the valley. I only knew I needed to leave. The walk back to my car felt endless. The sun was bright, the sky clear, but none of it made me feel safer. Every sound in the grass felt intentional. Every gust of wind felt like someone exhaling behind me. When I finally reached the car, I locked the doors instantly even though it was broad daylight. I kept checking the mirror as I drove back down the dirt road, half expecting to see someone standing in the tall grass. When I reached the highway, I felt the tension drain from my chest, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I didn't tell anyone about the prints or the sounds because I didn't want people to think I panicked over nothing. But the truth is I have camped since then, and I still cannot sleep fully. Every time the wind shakes my tent at night, I wait to feel that slow vibration in the soil again. I still don't know who or what was walking around my camp those 2 nights, but I know it wasn't an animal. And I know it wasn't something lost or harmless. Whatever it was, It chose to walk around me instead of away. That part is what stays in my head the most. The idea that it came back the second night, moving slowly, taking its time, studying the tent, leaving prints deeper than my own. I left that valley behind, but sometimes when I lie awake, I imagine those long steps in the dirt, circling again and again, waiting for the right moment to come closer. And I'm certain that if I had stayed one more night, it would have. I went camping alone in the late summer of 2019, in a remote part of northern Idaho, near a lake that didn't even show up on every map. I was 26 at the time and had been trying to push myself to spend more time outdoors. My life felt too predictable back then, and I kept telling myself that a few nights in the quiet woods would reset my mind. I picked a spot far from popular campgrounds because I didn't want to hear cars, music, or other people. I wanted to feel completely away from everything. Looking back now, I think that desire to isolate myself is what put me in a situation I still think about almost every night. The first day felt peaceful. The lake was small but looked clean and untouched. The surface was flat like a sheet of dark glass, and the air smelled like cold water and pine sap. My tent sat on a patch of soft dirt between tall trees that leaned slightly toward the lake as if they were watching it. I spent most of the afternoon gathering wood, checking my gear, and trying to treat the whole trip like something productive instead of a lazy escape. When the sun dropped, the temperature sank faster than I expected, and the forest grew so silent that even the soft crunch of my footsteps sounded too loud. By the second morning, I noticed something strange. Not supernatural, not dramatic, just off. About 20 yards from my tent, I found a circle of freshly overturned dirt. It wasn't large, maybe the size of two hands together, but it was definitely new. The soil was darker, damp, and had sharp, clean edges. Something had dug there overnight. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake a tight feeling in my chest. I told myself it was probably a rabbit or a fox. The forest had plenty of signs of wildlife. Droppings, broken branches, tracks. Everything made sense logically, but I kept checking over my shoulder as I walked back to my tent. That night, something woke me around 3 in the morning. I didn't know what it was at first. There was no sudden noise or light. It was more like a shift in the air, a heavy stillness pressing against the thin walls of my tent. My breathing sounded too loud inside the sleeping bag. I stayed completely still and waited, listening to my heartbeat thumping inside my own ears. Then I heard it. A slow, steady crunch of footsteps moving through the brush. They were not the quick, light steps of an animal. They were heavier, cautious, measured. Someone was walking near my tent. I wanted to sit up, but I couldn't move. Every muscle tightened until my neck hurt. The footsteps circled the tent slowly, almost curiously. Dry pine needles snapped under the weight. At one point, the steps stopped right behind my head. I held my breath until my lungs burned. If whoever it was leaned forward, they could have touched the fabric of the tent. I didn't hear any talking, no breathing, just the oppressive quiet of someone standing still in the dark. After what felt like minutes, the steps moved away, grew softer, then faded completely. Even after they disappeared, I stayed still for another hour, afraid that any small movement would give away that I was awake. When morning finally came, the light looked gray and weak. I stepped outside slowly, scanning the trees, expecting something to jump out, but the forest looked calm and empty. I checked the dirt around my tent and saw a few places where the pine needles had been disturbed, but nothing clear enough to make out a shoe print. The lack of evidence made my skin crawl. I kept thinking how close those steps had been, how slow and deliberate they sounded. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I told myself I was overreacting. People sometimes pass through these woods. Maybe it was just a hunter. Maybe someone wandered too far from their campsite. Those explanations felt thin, but I clung to them. The third night was colder, and the sky turned cloudy, making everything darker than before. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion pulled me under. Sometime past midnight, I woke again, but this time it wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of water splashing, quiet but steady, like something wading into the lake. I unzipped part of the tent door just enough to look out. The lake sat about 15 feet away, barely visible in the dim light. First, I saw nothing. Then, near the center of the lake, I noticed a faint ripple cutting across the surface. The ripple moved in a slow, straight line, not like a fish or drifting log. It looked like something swimming. I pulled back inside the tent and waited. My stomach felt hollow. After a while, the splash sound stopped, replaced by the soft rustle of brush again, this time farther away. I didn't sleep again until the sun came up. In the morning, I walked toward the shoreline to check for tracks. The mud near the edge showed prints, deep, unmistakably human. Bare feet. Both of them pointed straight toward my campsite. The toes were long, the arches very defined, and the stride was wide enough to belong to someone tall. The mud was still moist inside the prints, meaning they were fresh. I felt a cold wave move through my chest. Someone had been in the lake, in the dark, with no clothes, and walked straight toward where I slept. That was the moment something in my mind snapped into clarity. I packed my tent as fast as I ever have in my life. My hands shook so badly that I dropped the poles twice. I didn't bother folding anything properly. I shoved everything into my backpack, throwing gear around, checking the tree line every few seconds. The entire time I felt watched. Not imagined, not exaggerated, watched. The silence felt like pressure on the back of my neck. The hike back to my car took nearly an hour, but it felt twice as long. Every sound behind me made my shoulders tense. At one point, I heard a branch snap somewhere deep in the woods, and I started walking faster, almost running. When I finally reached the dirt road, my throat felt dry and sore, and my shirt clung to my back with sweat. The sight of my car felt unreal, like I wasn't supposed to make it back to it. When I got inside, I locked the doors immediately, even though I was alone. I sat there for a long time before turning the ignition. I couldn't stop picturing those footprints, the way they pointed toward my tent, the slow footsteps in the night, and the ripple moving across the lake. There was no mystery to solve, no supernatural explanation, nothing dramatic waiting to be revealed. The truth was simple and terrifying. A real person had been watching me, walking around my tent, swimming in the lake at night, and getting close enough to touch the thin barrier between us. I drove away and never returned to that area. I still camp sometimes, but only in places where other people are nearby. I never sleep deeply outdoors anymore. The quiet no longer feels peaceful. It feels like space for someone to move without making a sound. And every time I close my eyes in a tent, I still remember those slow footsteps circling me in the dark, and those bare footprints leading straight from the water to where I slept alone. I was 26 when I decided to take a short camping trip by myself in the fall of 2014. I had been working long hours at a warehouse in northern Georgia, and my head felt crowded all the time. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere empty, somewhere that did not have constant noise. So I drove into a less popular part of the Chattahoochee National Forest, an area where people rarely stayed overnight because it had no marked campsites and the trails were rough. I did not mind the roughness. I wanted silence. I wanted cold air, pine needles under my boots, long empty slopes, and the feeling that the world was much bigger than the small problems I carried around every day. By the time I reached the dirt road that led deeper into the woods, the sun was already getting low. The sky had that pale gold color that only lasts for a few minutes before it slips into early evening. I found a wide, flat patch of ground near a cluster of boulders and decided it was good enough for the night. I pitched my tent, set up my small stove, and spent some time collecting dead branches for a fire. The air smelled like damp leaves and cold stone. I could hear nothing but the faint rustling of the trees as the wind moved through them. No cars, no voices, not even birds for a while. As it got darker, I sat by the fire and tried to let my thoughts settle. The heat felt good on my hands, and the crackling of the wood seemed steady and calming. I ate a simple meal, nothing fancy, and watched the flames rise and fall. I kept glancing around out of habit, but the forest was quiet. Too quiet, maybe, for someone used to city noise, but it felt peaceful at first. When the fire began to die down, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. I liked the feeling of being closed in something small, a tiny circle of warmth in the middle of endless dark trees. I don't know how long I was asleep when I woke up again, but it was still night. I could tell by how cold the air felt through the thin tent walls. My first thought was that something outside had snapped a branch. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to pull me out of sleep. I laid still, trying to listen for more sounds. At first, there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the forest. Then I heard something again, a slow, steady crunch of weight on dry leaves. Not fast, not running, just something moving, step by step, in a way that felt careful but heavy enough to be unsettling. I tried to tell myself it was a deer, maybe a big one, or a stray dog, or even a bear. The forest had all sorts of animals, but the pattern of the steps didn't feel right. It wasn't the uneven rhythm of an animal. It was paced, very slow, almost deliberate, like someone trying not to make noise but failing to hide the weight of their movement. I stayed absolutely still. My heart was hitting harder against my ribs with each second. I tried to slow my breathing because the air inside the tent suddenly felt too loud, like each breath was something that could give me away. The footsteps continued, circling wide at first, then moving closer. I could hear leaves pressing under weight, and I realized how thin my tent was. Just fabric, just a zipper, nothing solid between me and whatever was walking out there. The steps stopped for a moment. I didn't know if the thing or the person was looking at my campsite or listening or standing still to figure out something. That part scared me more than the footsteps. The not moving, the waiting. I felt like every second stretched into a long rope being pulled tight. After maybe a full minute of silence, the footsteps started again. But now they were closer, much closer. I could hear the slight drag of something brushing along the ground. Maybe a boot, maybe a sleeve, maybe branches against clothing. The sound stopped right near the boulders where I had stored my small bag of food. I could hear the soft clink of the metal mug I had left outside. That made my stomach tighten even more. Someone was touching my things. I wanted to reach for the pocket knife I kept near my sleeping bag, but the idea of moving even a little felt dangerous. I didn't want the shape outside to know I was awake. I didn't want it to know anything about me at all. I felt the cold creeping through the bottom of the tent and settling into my legs. I stayed frozen in place, counting my own breaths in the darkness. After what felt like forever, the sounds shifted again. The footsteps backed away slowly, almost like someone retreating after inspecting something. They moved toward the trees on the opposite side of my clearing. Then they faded, step by step, until I could no longer hear them. I stayed awake for hours after that, waiting for the sound to come back. It never did. When the sky finally started to lighten, I unzipped the tent with shaky hands. The air felt heavy and cold. I looked around before stepping out, checking each shadow between the trees. Nothing moved. My campsite looked almost the same except for one thing. My metal mug, which I had left on a rock near the fire pit, was now lying several feet away in the dirt. There were deep prints in the ground, not animal prints but heavy shoe marks, pressed into the soft earth in a clear path around my tent, then farther out, then toward the trees. They were fresh, too fresh. I packed everything faster than I ever had in my life. My hands shook while rolling the tent, and I kept turning around to make sure nothing was watching me. The forest still looked calm, still looked beautiful in the morning sun, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there for reasons I didn't want to know. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't an animal checking out food. The prints were too close to where I slept. Whoever it was had stood just steps away from me in the dark. When I finally reached the dirt road and got back into my car, I locked the doors immediately. As I drove away, the trees thinned out and the sky opened above the highway, but my chest stayed tight for a long time. I kept seeing those prints in my head, circling my tent, stopping, waiting, watching. I never went back to that part of the forest again. I still camp sometimes, but not alone, not deep in unmarked places, and not without thinking of that night. The ending was simple but clear to me the moment I left those woods. Whatever walked around my tent wasn't lost, wasn't wandering, and wasn't confused. It knew exactly where it was going, and it chose to walk right up to me. That thought stayed with me long after the forest disappeared in my rearview mirror, and it still does whenever I feel too comfortable in quiet places. I drove into the northern woods of Alberta in the late summer of 2019, thinking a quiet weekend alone would help me clear my head. I had been working long days for months, and the idea of camping alone felt peaceful, almost like a reward I had earned. I picked a spot near an old logging road that barely showed up on maps anymore. Most people stayed closer to the lake several kilometers south, but I wanted something more isolated. I was 31 then, still confident enough to believe nothing bad could happen if I planned things properly. The air felt clean when I stepped out of the car. There was the smell of pine sap, dirt, and the faint dryness of the late-season grass. I spent the first hour choosing the exact spot to set up my tent. Slightly raised ground, soft soil, far enough from the trees to avoid falling branches but close enough to feel sheltered. I unpacked slowly, taking my time, making neat piles of things, checking each item twice like a small ritual that made me feel safe. I built a fire ring from rocks I found near a shallow ditch and set out my small metal pot, water bottles, and a basic first aid kit. I kept telling myself that everything was under control. When the sun dipped behind the trees, the temperature dropped quicker than I expected. It wasn't freezing, but it was the kind of cold that makes your skin tighten when the wind brushes past. I ate canned beans heated over the fire, taking long, slow bites, listening to the crackle of burning wood. The forest around me made constant soft noises, branches tapping each other, insects buzzing, something small rustling through leaves every few minutes. It all felt normal, familiar even. I had grown up camping with my family, and the first night had always been the calmest. But sometime around midnight, I woke up to a sound heavy enough to pull me straight out of sleep. It wasn't an animal sniffing around the tent or the usual scratching of something passing by. It was a dull, firm thump, like something solid hitting the ground not far away. My heart sped up immediately, and I felt that strange mix of confusion and fear that comes when you're ripped from a dream. I lay still on my sleeping bag, barely breathing, trying to hear past the sound of my own heartbeat. A second thump came, slower and heavier than the first. Then everything went quiet again. I waited, staring into the dark fabric of my tent, trying to convince myself it was probably just a falling branch. But I had walked around earlier, checking for hazards, and there were no heavy branches above me. I told myself to stay calm, to think clearly, but my mind kept replaying the sound, exaggerating it, making it feel bigger and closer. Eventually, the fear faded enough for me to fall asleep again. When morning came, the forest felt normal again. Quiet, a little windy, but harmless. I stepped outside and scanned the area. I didn't see anything unusual, no big imprint on the ground, no broken branch, nothing that explained what I heard. I tried brushing it off, telling myself it was just the forest shifting, but something stayed with me, a subtle tension I couldn't shake. I spent most of the day hiking north along what used to be the logging road. It was rough and overgrown, with patches of soft moss and wild plants curling over the stones. A few times I thought I saw tire ruts like someone had driven through recently, but they were faint and scattered. At one point, a cold feeling ran up my back when I noticed what looked like a single boot print in the dirt. Not fresh, but not old enough to crumble at a touch. It pointed toward the same direction I had come from. The more I stared at it, the more convinced I became that it didn't belong to me. Mine were heavy-soled and wider. This one looked narrower, flatter, like someone wearing light hiking boots or work shoes had passed through. I kept telling myself that people occasionally wandered off-trail, that the woods were public land, that nothing was strange about another person being there at some time. But it still bothered me that it pointed toward my campsite. By the time I returned, the sky had turned gray, and the wind had picked up. I decided to collect more firewood while there was still light. I moved around the area slowly, picking up fallen branches, stacking them under my arm. At one point, I knelt to grab a piece of wood and noticed the soil near the back edge of my campsite looked disturbed. The ground had a slightly different color, like it had been compressed and shifted recently. I crouched there for a long minute, feeling my stomach twist. Something had stepped there. I tried to tell myself it could have been an animal, but the shape was too clean, too flat and wide, more like the heel portion of a boot than anything else. My nerves started waking up again, the same tight pressure I felt the night before. I stayed near the fire for the rest of the evening, feeding it more wood than necessary, wanting the heat and the light. Every time the fire cracked loudly, I jumped. When night fell completely, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and laid there listening to every sound. The wind moved through the trees in long waves. Something small scurried across the leaves now and then. For a long time nothing else happened, and I thought maybe it had all been in my head. Then a different sound came, steps, slow and deliberate, moving through the grass. They weren't the random pattern of an animal. They were spaced in a steady rhythm, each one pressing down on the earth with a weight that made the ground feel heavy. The steps grew closer until they stopped just outside the tent. I froze completely. My hands were shaking so hard I had to press them against the sleeping bag to keep quiet. I could hear breathing, not loud, but steady, controlled, like someone was trying to stay quiet. My chest tightened with fear so intense it felt like my whole body locked up. The shape outside the tent didn't move for at least a full minute. It just stood there, breathing softly, like it was listening for any small sound inside. Then, just as slowly, the steps moved away. Not running, not rushing, just calm, steady steps fading into the forest. I didn't sleep at all after that. I kept waiting for the steps to return, for the breathing to come back to the tent wall. When the sky finally started lightening, I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands fumbled with the tent poles, and I kept checking the tree line every few seconds. The forest felt different now, no longer peaceful, no longer quiet. Felt watched. When I looked around one last time before leaving, I noticed another print near the edge of my campsite. Clear, fresh, the same narrow shape as the others, pointed straight toward where my tent had been. That was enough for me. I got into my car and drove out of the woods without looking back. Even as the trees thinned and the road widened, the feeling stayed with me, that someone had been out there, moving through the forest at night, watching my small patch of light between the trees. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I know it was real. There were no ghosts, no creatures, nothing supernatural. Just a person walking through the dark woods, close enough to breathe outside my tent. That is what scares me the most now. The simple fact that a real person had been there, so silent, so patient, wandering among the trees while I slept, thinking I was alone. And that weekend taught me something important. Isolation feels peaceful until you realize you might not be the only one seeking it. After that trip, I never camped alone again. I still remember the way the cold air stung my face that night, a feeling I didn't think much of at first. It was late September of 2016, and I had taken a week off work to reconnect with the outdoors, something I used to love when I was younger. I picked a remote campground in northern Idaho, a place I had only seen in a few online photos, but the pictures showed a calm lake, dense pine forests, and rough trails that didn't look too crowded. That was exactly what I wanted: space, quiet, and time away from people. I reached the spot early in the afternoon, parked my old gray SUV on a patch of dirt, and started carrying my things down to a flat area near the water. The lake was wider than it looked in the photos, with still water that reflected the sky like a piece of glass. The tree line around it felt closer than usual, as if the forest leaned inward. Everything smelled like wet leaves, pine sap, and cold air. I felt lucky to have the place almost entirely to myself. I set up my tent a little farther from the shoreline and placed my backpack, food container, and sleeping bag inside. The sun was bright, the wind was low, and nothing felt out of place. I walked around the edge of the lake, taking slow breaths, listening to the faint sounds of insects and the crackling of dry branches under my boots. The quiet was strange at first, not peaceful, but heavy, like something was sitting on the silence. As evening fell, I made a small fire with the dry wood I had collected earlier. I ate, cleaned up, and placed the food container inside the SUV so animals wouldn't try to get into it. The temperature dropped fast, quicker than I expected for September. I zipped up my jacket and sat near the fire, trying to keep my hands warm. The sky turned completely dark by 8 p.m., and the only light came from the flames. I remember thinking about how far I was from everything. From roads, from towns, from help. The nearest ranger station was something like 12 miles away. My phone had no signal. It felt exciting when I planned the trip, but now, sitting alone with nothing but the sounds of snapping branches and distant wind, it felt a little different. Around midnight, the fire had burned down to weak orange coals. I decided to turn in for the night. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag inside the tent, leaving only a small opening at the top to breathe cooler air. The fabric walls moved slightly whenever the breeze picked up, and the ground beneath the tent felt colder than before. I tried to sleep, telling myself that the eerie quiet was part of the experience. But around 2 a.m., something woke me. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a squirrel digging through leaves. But then I heard something heavier. Footsteps, slow, careful, spaced apart. Not fast like an animal, not scratching or scurrying. These were methodical, like someone trying not to make noise. I froze inside my sleeping bag. My breathing became shallow, and I kept telling myself it was probably a deer. But the weight of the steps didn't feel right. They were too soft for something large and too heavy for something small. I lay perfectly still, listening, counting each step as it circled somewhere outside the tent. The sound stopped. I waited, muscles tense, skin prickling. The air inside the tent felt warm from my breath, but I felt cold everywhere else. For a long moment, nothing happened. I thought maybe I had imagined it. Then I heard a faint crunch, closer this time. Then another, and another. Something was right outside. I held my breath until my chest hurt. My mind raced with explanations, maybe an elk, maybe a lost hiker, maybe a black bear. But none of those moved like this. None of those paused long enough to listen the way this did. I could feel the presence outside the thin fabric, like a pressure in the air. A shadow passed over the tent as something blocked the moonlight. I wanted to look, but I was too afraid to move. I stared at the roof of the tent, waiting for it to collapse or shake or tear. But nothing like that happened. Instead, whatever it was stood there for a long time, barely moving, as if it was studying the tent, trying to figure out what was inside. Eventually, after what felt like an hour but was probably just a few minutes, the footsteps drifted away. Slow at first, then fading into the forest. I stayed awake until the sky turned pale gray. Every noise made me flinch. When the morning finally came, I crawled out of the tent and looked around. The ground was covered with old dry pine needles and damp soil, but near the tent, I saw impressions. Not full footprints, but clear enough to tell they were human. Someone had walked around my campsite while I slept. The marks were fresh. My stomach tightened. My eyes scanned the tree line again and again. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I packed up faster than I ever had in my life. Every branch crack, every bird call made me jump. When I loaded the last bag into the SUV, I looked around one more time. The lake was calm, the air was clear, and everything looked normal. Too normal, as if the forest was pretending nothing happened. As I started driving away, the gravel under the tires crunching loudly, I saw something that made every hair on my body stand up. On a tree near the entrance to the old dirt road, someone had carved a vertical line, fresh, pale wood exposed beneath the bark. Below it, another line, and another. 3 marks, sharp and new, as if someone had carved them during the night. I don't know what they meant. Maybe nothing, maybe something. I didn't stop to check. I kept driving until I reached the main road, and even then, I didn't slow down. The whole way home, I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps, the shadow, and the marks on the tree. Someone had been out there with me, close enough to touch the tent, close enough to hear me breathe. I never reported it. I couldn't describe the person because I never saw them. But I didn't go camping alone again after that. Not once. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the neighborhood feels too still, I think about how easily the fabric of that tent could have been cut open. How easily someone could have dragged me out into the darkness, and no one would have known where I went. I was 31 when I decided to take a weekend alone in the hills outside Port Orford, Oregon. It was late October, cold enough at night to make your breath look like smoke, but not cold enough to freeze the water bottles. I wanted some quiet after a long month at work, and I thought camping alone would reset my mind a bit. I had camped many times before, and I felt comfortable being on my own. I packed my old dark green tent, a small stove, a heavy jacket, and enough food for 2 nights. The drive took a little more than 4 hours, and by the time I reached the trailhead, the sky had already gone gray and dull. The trail went straight into a thick forest of tall pines with long, dark branches. The ground was soft with layers of old needles, and every step made a low crunch under my boots. The air smelled like cold dirt and old wood. I walked for about an hour until I reached a small clearing near a creek. The clearing wasn't anything special, just an open space with dead leaves, a few rotting logs, and a patch of grass that looked like it had been pressed down by deer at some point. But it was flat and close to water, so I decided it was good enough. After setting up my tent, I walked down to the creek. The water moved fast, almost too fast for such a narrow stream. It made a constant rushing sound, almost like a whispering noise that never stopped. I filled my bottle and sat on a rock for a while, letting the cold air numb my face. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. No cars, no people, no phone service. That quiet you only get far away from town. When the sun got low, I made a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The temperature dropped quickly once the light began to fade. I sat near the fire, warming my hands, watching sparks drift up into the dark. I kept listening to the forest because when you're alone, your ears start to feel like they're working harder. I heard branches snapping here and there, but that was normal. Animals always moved around at night. I didn't think too much about it. Around midnight, I lay inside my tent wrapped in my sleeping bag. The fire had died down, leaving only a faint orange glow under the ash. I closed my eyes, but every sound felt close and sharp. A slow rustling near the creek, a quick scamper in the brush, the distant hoot of an owl. After a while, I began drifting off, but then I heard something heavier than before. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't the soft movement of a raccoon or a deer either. It was a slow, deliberate step, then another, then silence. I lay still, my heart beat faster, and I tried to control my breathing. I waited, hoping the sound would fade into the forest like everything else. But after a few seconds, I heard it again. Another step, closer this time. The crunch of pine needles was faint but sharp enough to know it wasn't my imagination. I reached for my flashlight slowly, careful not to make noise. My hand shook a little. I clicked the light on, letting the beam shine through the thin tent wall. The shape outside didn't move, but I could tell something big was standing between my tent and the trees. I didn't want to unzip the tent. I didn't want to see what was there. I just listened. After a few long moments, the footsteps moved again, this time circling slightly around my camp instead of walking away. I could hear breathing, slow and steady, too deep to be any animal I knew. It wasn't fast enough for a bear, not light enough for a human. It was just slow and heavy. The steps went toward the creek, then toward the logs near my fire pit, then back near the tent. My skin felt tight, like the cold air was pressing against it. This went on for almost 10 minutes, though it felt much longer. The beam of my flashlight kept shaking because my hands wouldn't stay steady. Then, as suddenly as it started, the steps stopped. I listened hard, waiting for another movement, but I heard nothing except the creek's constant rushing. I stayed awake for hours, scared the sound would come back, scared I would hear the heavy steps right beside my tent. I didn't sleep until the sky started turning pale. When I stepped out in the morning, the first thing I noticed was the ground. Pine needles and dirt were disturbed all around my camp. Not torn up, just pressed down, flattened, like someone had walked circles around the fire pit and near the tent. But the footprints weren't clear. They looked smudged, blended with the natural mess of the forest floor. I crouched down to look closer, but all I could see were overlapping depressions. Nothing that told me what or who it was. I tried to calm myself by telling my mind it was probably an elk or something large that wandered into the clearing at night. But elk don't walk in slow circles, and they don't stand still for minutes at a time, and they don't breathe like that. I packed my gear quicker than I ever had before. Even as the sun rose higher, I felt watched. I kept looking back into the trees, half expecting something to move between the trunks. The silence felt different now, not peaceful, but tense, like the forest was holding its breath. The hike back to the trailhead took longer than it should have. My legs felt weak, and I kept hearing soft crunching behind me, though every time I stopped and turned, nothing moved. The feeling stayed with me until I reached my car. When I finally got home later that day, I checked the news out of curiosity. I wasn't looking for anything specific, but I found something that made my stomach twist. A man around my age had gone missing 2 weeks earlier in the same stretch of woods. His campsite had been found abandoned, gear scattered, no signs of struggle, nothing stolen, just gone. The report mentioned that someone else had filed a strange complaint about hearing heavy footsteps around their campsite on another night earlier that month. I didn't go back to those woods after that. I still camp sometimes, but never alone, never far from other people. And even now, years later, when I lie in a tent at night and the forest grows quiet, I still think about those slow, heavy steps circling my campsite, and how something stood just outside my thin tent wall, close enough to hear its breathing. And every time I think about it, I realize how lucky I am that whatever it was didn't decide to unzip the tent or wait until I fell asleep again. I left the woods that morning, and I think that was the only reason I didn't end up like the man they never found. I didn't plan on camping alone that weekend, but plans fall apart in small ways that somehow still push you out the door. It was late September 2018, a week before my 27th birthday, and I wanted one quiet night outside the crowded city. I chose a remote valley in northern Wyoming, a place I had only seen once during a road trip years earlier. It wasn't a popular site, which made it cheap and peaceful, but it also meant fewer people around if anything went wrong. At the time, that didn't bother me. I felt confident, maybe too confident, after a long summer of hiking. The drive took nearly 5 hours, and by the time I reached the narrow dirt road leading into the valley, the sun was sitting low behind the hills. The road was uneven and full of loose rocks, the kind that made my tires slide a little each time I turned. Dust covered the front of my car and stuck to the windshield in a thin layer. As I drove farther in, I saw no other vehicles, no campfires, no signs of anyone else. The air grew colder as the shadows stretched longer, and the wind carried the sharp smell of pine. It felt empty in a way that was both calming and slightly uncomfortable, like the world was waiting for something. When I reached a flat clearing near a small creek, I parked and stepped out. The quiet was so heavy it almost felt thick. There were no birds, no insects, no movement in the trees except the slow sway caused by the breeze. I set up my tent close to the creek, hammered the stakes into the soft ground, and gathered dry branches for a fire. Every small sound I made felt too loud against the stillness around me. Even the snap of a twig under my boot echoed a little. As the sky turned dark blue, I lit my fire and boiled water for a simple meal. The flames gave off a steady heat and lit up the area around me in a soft orange glow. Beyond that circle of light, everything looked much darker than it should have. I ate slowly, enjoying the warmth on my face while the night continued to settle. The cold pressed in from behind me, almost like a wall. I could feel it on the back of my neck whenever I turned away from the fire. Around 10 p.m., I put out the flames, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself in. The ground felt colder than I expected, and the sleeping bag kept shifting every time I moved. I lay on my back listening to the shallow water of the creek moving over stones. It was a constant, calming sound, but in the darkness it also felt strangely close, like it was creeping nearer even though I knew it wasn't. Sometime after midnight, I woke up without knowing why. I didn't hear anything at first. Everything was silent, too silent. Even the creek sounded distant, like the flow had softened. I lay completely still, holding my breath, waiting for something to explain the sudden alertness running through my body. My heart was beating faster than it should have. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy ones, not the quick, light movement of an animal. They were on the dry ground somewhere behind my tent. The steps were uneven, dragging a little, like whoever or whatever was walking was tired or injured. I felt my stomach tighten. My hands froze on top of the sleeping bag. The footsteps stopped, then started again, this time closer. I could hear the weight shifting on the dirt, the subtle crunch of dead leaves being pressed down. For a moment, I considered unzipping the tent just a little to look outside, but fear locked me in place. The thin fabric felt like the only barrier I had. I tried to breathe quietly, hoping whoever was out there would keep moving. Instead, the steps circled the tent. They were slow, deliberate, almost as if someone was inspecting the area. My mouth felt dry, and every muscle in my body tensed so tightly it hurt. After what felt like minutes, the footsteps drifted away toward the trees. I waited, listening hard. When I heard nothing else, I forced myself to stay still. I didn't want to risk making any noise. I lay awake until the sky began to brighten, and only then did I unzip the tent and step out. The cold morning air hit me first. Then I saw the ground. Fresh footprints circled my campsite. They were human boot prints, but larger than mine and pointing in different directions. Whoever had been walking around my tent had come alarmingly close, close enough to touch the fabric if they wanted to. The prints looked deep, like the person was carrying something heavy or was struggling to walk. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. My first thought was that maybe it was another camper, but I hadn't seen a single car on the way in. There were no signs of gear nearby, no tracks from a vehicle, no leftover ashes from a fire. It looked like whoever walked around my camp had been traveling on foot for a long time. I packed my gear faster than I ever had in my life. My hands shook as I took down the tent, and I kept looking over my shoulder toward the tree line. Every shadow between the trees felt suspicious. I dumped the last of my water on the remains of the fire pit, climbed into my car, and locked the doors immediately. As I drove back up the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror. The valley looked calm again, unchanged, but the uneasiness stayed with me. When I reached the main highway, the tension in my shoulders finally started to fade, but the memory of those slow footsteps didn't. Someone had been there in the dark with me, close, quiet, watching. Maybe they were lost, maybe they were passing through, or maybe they had worse intentions. I never found out, and maybe it's better that way. The only clear thing, the thing that stayed with me the most, was how quickly isolation can turn from peaceful to threatening. I had gone there looking for silence and space, and I found them, but not in the way I expected. That night made me understand how vulnerable a person can feel with nothing but thin fabric between themselves and the unknown. I haven't camped alone since then, and I don't think I ever will again. I never planned to camp alone that summer, but things pushed me into it. I was 24, tired of my job, tired of noise, tired of people. I thought a few days in the quiet would help me reset. I picked a place far from where I lived, a forested area in northern Montana, close to an old trail that barely showed up on maps. I didn't tell many people because I wanted the trip to feel private. I reached the small clearing late in the afternoon, and the air felt heavy, as if it were holding back a storm even though the sky was mostly clear. I set my tent near a line of tall pine trees. The ground was uneven in some places, so I spent extra time smoothing out the dirt under the tent, making sure it felt flat enough. I cooked simple food on a small stove, nothing fancy, and ate while watching the sun sink behind the trees. The silence felt strange at first. Cities have a constant hum, even at night, but the woods had these long moments where nothing made a sound except wind brushing through branches. At first I enjoyed it, but later it started feeling like I was waiting for something to break the quiet. When darkness grew deep, the air got colder, and I climbed into my tent. I kept a small battery lantern beside my sleeping bag and tried to read, but I kept checking the sounds outside. Every tiny noise seemed louder in that stillness. Twigs snapping, leaves shifting, distant rustles that could have been any animal. I kept telling myself it was normal, that forests weren't meant to be silent. I finally fell asleep, but sometime in the night I woke up without knowing why. My heart was racing. It was pitch black except for a faint glow from the lantern. I lay still, listening. There was nothing at first, just wind. Then I heard something slow, deliberate steps. They were not heavy enough to be a large animal, but not light enough to be something small. The steps stopped and started again, moving around the edge of my tent. I felt this tight pressure in my chest. I held my breath and waited for them to go away. After a few moments, the sounds faded, but I couldn't sleep again. I lay awake until I saw morning light through the fabric of the tent. When I unzipped it and stepped outside, the air smelled like damp dirt. Everything looked normal. Nothing was moved, nothing was broken. For a moment, I convinced myself I had dreamed the whole thing. I hiked a long stretch that day. The trails were uneven and overgrown. I noticed old tire tracks in one muddy patch, but they didn't look like normal hiking traffic. They were deeper, wider, maybe from an off-road truck. The tracks looked fresh, and that bothered me because I hadn't passed any cars on the way in. The only road that led there was rough, almost hidden by brush. It wasn't a place someone would visit casually. Back at camp, I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I ate early and decided I would sleep before sunset. But when night came, the forest felt different from the night before. The air had gone still, the wind had died, and everything felt too quiet, as if the woods were holding their breath with me. I lay inside my tent again and shut off my lantern to save power. After maybe an hour, I heard the steps again. This time they were slower, closer. My skin went cold. I didn't move. The steps circled halfway around the tent, paused, continued, then stopped right near the entrance. I could hear breathing, soft, steady human breathing. I felt the fabric of the tent shift slightly, like someone brushed it with their fingers. I didn't want to imagine a face staring into the thin fabric. The breathing continued for a long moment, then faded as the steps moved away again. This time they didn't return. I stayed awake until morning, heart pounding, gripping the small knife I kept next to my bag. I didn't step outside until sunlight filled the clearing. The ground around my tent told me enough. There were footprints, human footprints. They were small enough to tell me nothing useful, but they were fresh and clear in the soft soil. Someone had walked around my tent while I slept. I knew then I shouldn't stay another night. I packed everything fast, barely eating breakfast. My hands shook a little as I folded the tent. I kept looking over my shoulder at the trees, expecting someone to step out, but no one did. When my pack was ready, I set off down the trail. The walk back felt much longer than the walk in. I stopped a few times just to listen. At one point, far behind me, I thought I heard another set of steps. Fast ones, like someone jogging on uneven ground. I didn't see anyone when I looked, but the sound made me walk faster. When I finally reached the dirt road where my car was parked, something felt off immediately. The driver's side door was cracked open. Not fully, but just enough that I knew I hadn't left it like that. When I got closer, I saw marks in the dirt near the door. More footprints. I checked the car inside. Nothing was missing, nothing was broken, but someone had definitely opened it. Maybe they looked through my things, maybe they didn't find anything they wanted. I didn't care. I only wanted to leave. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove the rough road faster than I should have. My hands gripped the wheel so tight they hurt. The forest looked darker than usual, even in daylight. Every shadow between the trees looked like someone standing there, watching me leave. When I reached the main road, I didn't look back. I drove straight to a small town an hour away and stopped in a gas station parking lot. Only then did I let myself breathe normally again. I sat there for a long time, thinking about how close someone had been to me while I slept. Not an animal, not some myth, a real person walking circles around my tent, listening to me breathe in the dark. I never went back to that place. I never camped alone again either. The trip had started as a way to clear my mind, but it taught me something different. The woods were never what scared me. It was people, silent, hidden, watching, who made the forest feel dangerous. And the worst part was knowing how easy it would have been for that person to unzip my tent, step inside, and I would have never even had time to react. I left that clearing behind, but the thought stayed with me. Every night after that trip, whenever I lay in my own bed, I would still hear those slow steps moving around me in the dark. And even though I knew I was safe, the memory always came back the same way. The breathing right outside the thin wall of the tent and the cold realization that someone had been studying me while I slept. That was the last time I tried to look for peace by running away from people. I learned that some of the scariest things aren't in stories or in my imagination. Some of them walk on two legs, stay quiet on purpose, and move just close enough to let you know they're there, before they disappear again, leaving only footprints and the memory of how close they got.